It started with the rain. Not a storm. Not the kind that clears a street or sends pigeons scattering into doorways. Just rain. The soft, directionless kind that London does better than anywhere else on Earth. The kind that doesn't fall so much as arrive like it had been there the whole time, and you'd only just noticed. I was standing on the pavement outside the gates on a Tuesday. A Tuesday in March, which in London means the sky has opinions, and none of them are kind. I hadn't planned to stop. I've been walking, that purposeless, slightly jet-lagged walking you do when a city is new to you and your body hasn't figured out what time zone your feet belong to. I had a coffee from Paper Cup. It had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and I was still carrying it because putting it down felt like admitting something. That I was tired, maybe. That the trip hadn't turned out the way I'd imagined. That I'd come 4,000 miles to feel, and instead felt nothing at all except the specific loneliness of being a stranger in a crowd of other strangers pretending they aren't strangers. You know the feeling. I stopped because of the guard. He was standing in his box, that famous red wooden sentry box they use outside the ceremonial buildings, the ones that tourists photograph with their arms around it like it's a person, which is ironic because there was a person inside it, and most of the tourists who'd been filing past all morning had treated him with roughly the same consideration they'd give a lamppost. His name, I found out later, was Lance Corporal Daniel Marsh, 23 years old, from a town in Shropshire I'd never heard of, a town where his father had worked 30 years in a plant that made metal casings for things Daniel had never been fully told about. His mother taught piano to children who didn't want to learn. He'd joined the army at 18 not because he'd wanted to, exactly, but because the alternative had been staying, and staying had felt like a kind of slow drowning he didn't have the vocabulary for at 18. I didn't know any of that Tuesday morning. All I knew was the uniform. The bearskin hat, enormous, absurd, an architectural decision masquerading as headgear. The red tunic, so aggressively red it looked like a challenge. The black trousers, the white gloves, the rifle. He was perfect, perfectly still. The kind of still that isn't relaxed, but is instead a war being waged inside a body that has been trained to show no evidence of the war. I'd seen guards before. I'd done the tourist thing years ago, a different trip, a different version of myself. I knew the protocol. You don't engage. They don't blink. They don't move unless they're marching or unless some drunk tourist gets too close, and then they do that thing, the shout, the stamp of the boot, that never fails to make a grown adult flinch. I knew all of that. But this morning I stopped, and I watched, and something in the watching felt necessary in a way I couldn't have explained. The rain came harder around 9:15. Not hard enough to scatter the tourists. There were maybe 40 of them clustered in the area, Japanese couples sharing umbrellas, a school group from somewhere in France whose teacher kept counting heads with the expression of a person who has been counting heads for 20 years and has found the number is always wrong. A couple of Americans with a selfie stick. 2 elderly women with sensible shoes, and a map they were interpreting optimistically. And Daniel Marsh standing perfectly still in the rain. He didn't have a coat. Of course he didn't. The uniform doesn't accommodate practicality. The uniform is the point. The uniform says, I do not adjust to discomfort. Discomfort adjusts to me. But I watched, and I swear this is true. I've thought about it too many times for it to have been imagined. I watched the rain change him. Not visibly. He didn't move. His posture didn't shift. His face remained exactly as it had been. A controlled absence of expression. Eyes fixed somewhere in middle distance. At a point just beyond the crowd that wasn't a thing so much as a disciplined decision to see nothing. But the rain touched him. It ran down the brim of that ridiculous hat. It darkened his shoulders. It caught in his eyelashes. I was close enough by then to see that I drifted forward without realizing the way you drift towards something that is quietly extraordinary. It caught in his eyelashes, and he couldn't blink it away because blinking was not currently on the schedule. And for a moment, maybe 3 seconds, maybe less, something moved across his face. Not a flinch, not discomfort. Something smaller and more complicated than either of those. Something I can only describe as recognition. Like the rain was a person he used to know. I need to tell you about the morning before I get to what happened, because the morning matters. Daniel had been on post since 7. He'd been awake since 5. which meant 4:45 in practice because there is always something, a boot that needs one more pass, a belt clasp that sits 1 millimeter off, and will bother him for 8 hours if he doesn't correct it now. He was meticulous in the way that people with unquiet minds are meticulous. Not because the details matter intrinsically, but because attending to details is a way of not attending to other things. He'd eaten breakfast in a mess. Eggs he didn't taste, toast he didn't finish, tea that was too hot, and then too cold because he kept forgetting to drink it. He'd sat with 4 other blokes and laughed at something and said maybe 6 words, and nobody had noticed the 6 words because the laughing was the social contract, and he fulfilled it. His phone had 3 unread messages. He hadn't opened them. He knew what they'd say. 2 from his mom, 1 from a girl in Shrewsbury he'd been meaning to call for 2 weeks. They'd say ordinary things. The ordinary things people say when they don't know what else to say, and he'd reply with ordinary things, and both parties would finish the exchange feeling like they'd done something, feeling like they'd connected, when really they just traded words. Like poker chips, back and forth, a game with rules he understood, and outcomes he could predict, and a deep, wordless conviction that the whole enterprise was somehow beside the point of something he couldn't name. He'd stood in the briefing, receive his assignment, marched to his post with the discipline that had taken 18 months of his life to build into his body, into the architecture of his spine, and he'd taken his position in the box and begun the long project of being still. This was objectively his job. He was good at it. He was one of the best, his sergeant had said, and the sergeant was not a man who deployed praise carelessly, because Daniel Marsh had the quality that was hardest to teach. He knew how to inhabit stillness without fighting it. Most recruits treated stillness like imprisonment. Daniel had always treated it more like weather, something you stood inside. By 9 o'clock, he had been standing for 2 hours. His feet were the only part of him he allowed to have opinions about this, and he gave them no voice. The tourists came and went. A woman asked her husband to take a photo, and the husband took 14, reviewing each with the expression of a hostage negotiator assessing options. 3 children ran at the box before being gathered by parental arms. Somebody's loose helium balloon drifted past at eye level, listing sideways, a silver balloon in the shape of a star that had seen better days. He watched it without watching it, filed it away in the part of his brain that cataloged things. Silver star balloon, 907, drifting east. He didn't know why he cataloged things. He'd done it since he was a child. His mother had called it keeping inventory. His father had called it being somewhere else. They were both right, and neither was the whole truth. The rain arrived at 9:14. He felt it before he heard it. A change in pressure, a smell like copper and wet stone. Then the soft percussion of it on the brim of his bearskin, a sound like he thought, and it was an involuntary thought, the kind his mind produced without permission, like someone turning the pages of a book in another room. He stood inside it. The tourists scattered to varying degrees of urgency. Umbrellas bloomed in the crowd like sudden flowers. The French school group pulled hoods up in the choreographed chaos of children who have been asked to do something together and have interpreted the request individually. The elderly women with the map folded it calmly. The map was now cosmetically committed to London in the rain, and opened small, matching blue umbrellas that had clearly been packed for this exact contingency. He stood inside the rain, and the rain stood inside him, in the way that rain does when you've been still long enough for the world to stop treating you as a person and start treating you as geography. And something happened that he would not have been able to explain to anyone. The rain made sense. That's the only way he could have put it. Later, alone, turning the morning over in his hands like a stone he'd found and wasn't sure whether to keep. The rain made sense in a way that the morning hadn't, and the breakfast hadn't, and the 6 words in the mess and the 3 unread messages hadn't. The rain was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It was wet. It was indifferent. It didn't require anything from him. It touched him and moved on. It touched every surface equally. The stone, the pavement, the metal of the gate, his shoulders, a stranger's shoulder, the silver star balloon that had snagged on a railing 20 feet away and was now nodding in the wet. And it had no agenda about any of it. It asked him no questions. It did not need him to perform anything. It was simply there, and so was he, and that was enough. The thought arrived whole and quiet. That was for now enough. He breathed in the smell of rain on hot pavement. Though the pavement wasn't hot, this was London in March, but there was that smell anyway, that petrichor, which is a word he'd learned from a book he'd read at 16 in his room in Shropshire with the door closed while his parents spoke in the careful voices they used when they thought he couldn't hear. He breathed out. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. A woman across the pavement was watching him. He registered her. Coffee cup, dark coat, jet-lagged eyes, an expression he recognized because he'd seen it in mirrors. And then he moved his gaze back to the practiced nowhere. Back to the disciplined middle distance. But the 3 seconds sat in him. Warm, specific, more real than anything that had happened since 5 in the morning, when he'd woken in his bunk to the alarm's mechanical assault and lain there for a count of 4, staring at the ceiling, cataloging. Tuesday. March. Rain, probably. Daniel Marsh. Still here. The rain said, yes. Still here. That was enough that I almost left. I almost peeled myself off that pavement, tossed my dead coffee in the nearest bin, and walked back to the tube station and the hotel and the rest of the afternoon's carefully planned emptiness. I made a list, the way I do when I'm trying to convince myself I'm functioning. British Museum. Borough Market if it isn't too crowded. Maybe the Tate if my legs cooperate. My legs did not cooperate. I stayed. I'm not sure I made a decision about it. I think the staying happened to me the same way the rain was happening to everything else, without asking for consent. There was a boy nearby, maybe 9, maybe 10, who had become deeply uninterested in his parents and deeply interested in the Guard. He'd broken from the French school group without anyone noticing, because French school children on trips operate on a loose federation principle, and the teacher was occupied with a different crisis on the other side of the gate. He stood maybe 3 feet from the box, rain sheeting off his hood, chin tipped up, watching Daniel Marsh with the total focused attention that children give to things adults have learned to perform indifference about. The boy didn't photograph him, didn't try to make him laugh or nudge him or hold a sign next to his face. He just watched, with the frank anthropological interest of someone who has not yet been taught that staring is rude, or who has been taught, but considers it a negotiable rule. 2 minutes passed like this. The boy's mother arrived, grabbed his hand, spoke to him in rapid French that contained the word Viennes 4 times with escalating emphasis. The boy went, looking back over his shoulder. One last look. Cataloging. I thought, me too, kid. Around 9:40, a man materialized from the tourist crowd. I noticed him the way you notice things that are slightly wrong before you can articulate what the wrongness is, a wrongness that lives in the body before it reaches the brain. He was tall, mid-40s, in a jacket too light for the weather. He had the jittery confidence of someone who has decided to do something stupid and has committed to it to avoid reconsidering. He walked toward the box with his phone out, filming. This in itself wasn't unusual. Every second tourist had a phone out. The Guard was technically one of the most photographed humans on the planet, which is a strange kind of fame, to be seen by millions and known by none of them. But this man didn't stop at the polite distance everyone observed, partly out of decorum and partly out of a vague understanding that the rifle was real and the soldier was real, and the combination of those two facts suggested certain behavioral parameters. He kept walking. He was talking to his phone. I couldn't hear exactly. The rain had put a wash over the sound of everything, but the tone was the unmistakable tone of someone performing themselves for an audience. The gestured confidence, the slightly elevated voice, the sidelong awareness of how this was going to play to the camera. He stepped past the sign. Not the rope. There wasn't a rope here. This wasn't a museum. This was a street. But there are lines you can see if you know how to look. Social lines, territorial lines, lines drawn by the posture of the person standing inside them. He stepped across every one of them. He got close enough to lean into frame with the Guard, close enough to turn to the camera with an expression of gleeful transgression. "Mate," he said loudly, "you in there? You alive?" Daniel Marsh did not respond. His eyes did not move. The only sign that anything was occurring was a slight, almost imperceptible tightening at the corners of his jaw, a millimeter of recalibration, a soldier's body filing the intrusion and continuing its shift. Bet you hate this job, the man said, dropping into the approximate tone of one bloke speaking to another. The conspiratorial matiness of it. Just between us. Bet you'd love to just... He mimed an explosion from his own skull. Phone still rolling. A couple people laughed. Nervous laughs. The kind that come from being in the presence of someone crossing a line and not wanting to fully side against them, because siding against someone in a public space requires a kind of courage most of us spend our whole lives not developing. I felt my jaw tighten. I recognized the sensation. It was the exact opposite of the rain. The rain had been uncomplicated. This was very complicated in a specifically human way. Daniel did not move. The man took out a pen, I don't know where he produced it from, and held it near the guard's face. "Can I sign your hat?" He looked at the camera. Should I sign his hat? What happened next, I have reconstructed from what I saw and what I was told afterward, because there was a moment where I stopped being a witness and started being something else. Daniel Marsh was not angry. I want to be clear about that because it matters. What crossed his face was not anger. It was something more like arriving. Like a person who has been sitting in a waiting room for a very long time and has heard their name called and now stands, and the standing has nothing to do with frustration or urgency. It is simply time. He moved, not toward the man, not in a sudden, percussive way the tourist confrontation videos online always show, the boot stamp and the shout. He moved his eyes. That was all. He moved his eyes from the practiced middle distance to the man's face, and he held them there, and the specific quality of his stillness changed. It went from the stillness of a person standing outside a thing to the stillness of a person standing inside it. If you have ever had someone look at you, actually look at you, the way almost nobody does anymore, with the full committed weight of their attention, unfiltered by phone or self-consciousness or the performance of looking, you know what the man with the pen felt. You know in your body before your brain registers what's happening. The man lowered the pen, just slightly, an inch, maybe two. His phone arm dipped. Daniel said nothing, made no gesture. The jaw was back to neutral. His expression was the same controlled absence it had been for 3 hours. But the eyes were a different thing entirely. They were present, awake. They said, in the clearest language that requires no words, "I see you. I know exactly what you are doing. You can stop now." The man laughed, a reflexive laugh, the kind that buys time. He looked at his phone, then back at the guard, then made a show of being unbothered. "All right, mate," he said, backing up a step. One step, then two, just having a laugh. He walked away with his phone still recording, narrating his own departure to his imaginary audience, reframing the retreat as a choice. People do that. It's one of the saddest human tricks I know. The woman with the sensible shoes started clapping, softly twice, like a period at the end of a sentence. The rain had eased slightly by then. Still there, but more restrained. Considered. I realized I'd been clenching my coffee cup hard enough that the cardboard had buckled. The crowd around the gate had a different texture now. Not frightened, not quite excited, but present in a way that a crowd isn't usually present. That specific collective aliveness that happens when something real occurs in a space usually reserved for performances of the real. Tourism is, at its heart, a performance. We perform wonder, we perform discovery, we stand in front of things and feel the thing we've been told we ought to feel. But for a few minutes, nobody had been performing anything. The small boy with the hood was back at his mother's hand, but he was watching the box still. Processing. I was watching too. Daniel Marsh had returned to his practiced stillness. The middle distance. The dedicated absence of expression. But the rain was still there, on his shoulders, in his lashes, running in a thin line down the side of his neck. And there was again, that thing I'd seen earlier. Not the controlled absence. Something underneath it. A man who was very quietly, in the rain, in the complicated aftermath of a small confrontation he had won without words or violence. Alone in the way that people who are always surrounded never stop being alone. Living. Just living. Without being asked anything. Without being expected to produce anything. Without a word being required. I thought about the 3 unread messages I had on my own phone, the ones I'd been avoiding. Not because they were bad, they weren't, but because answering them required me to construct a version of myself that was coping, and coping was taking a lot of energy right now. And some mornings the energy simply wasn't there. The rain asked nothing of either of us. I found that I was grateful to it in a way that felt embarrassingly genuine. At 10:05, the changeover happened. There's a ceremony to it. Guards have a whole choreographed process of transition, precise and slightly theatrical, because everything in this system understands that form is not separate from function, that the way you hold a ritual is part of what makes the ritual hold. A small group of tourists who had been waiting specifically for this gathered and aimed their cameras. Daniel marched out his box. He marched the way he'd been trained to march. Eyes front, back straight, each footfall deliberate and even. He passed within 4 feet of where I was standing. And here is the thing I haven't told anyone. For a fraction of a second, less than a second, the kind of duration that could be a trick of the light or of a tired brain reading meaning into coincidence, his gaze swept the pavement in front of him and landed briefly on my face. Not the controlled gaze, not the careful middle distance. The other one, the one he turned on the man with the pen. The present, awake, actual one. It lasted maybe half a heartbeat. Then he was past me and marching, and the crowd was cheering softly the way crowds do, and the relief guard was taking the box, and the moment was gone the way rain goes gradually, and then all at once, and then you're standing in the after of it wondering if it left anything behind. I think he saw me watching. I think he recognized something. I don't know what. I don't have a tidy explanation for it. I've turned it over enough times to know that the turning isn't getting me anywhere useful, which usually means the point of the thing isn't the explanation, but the thing itself. I stood there with my buckled coffee cup in the lightning rain. The French school group was counting heads again. The elderly women were refolding their blue umbrellas with the practiced efficiency of people who have been folding things for decades and have made a kind of peace with impermanence. The Silver Star balloon was still on its railing, a bit more bedraggled now, but still oriented upwards, still technically a star. I stayed another 20 minutes, long past the point of any practical reason to stay. Sometimes you find yourself in the presence of something that doesn't need to be explained to matter. Sometimes a stranger's 3 seconds in the rain is more real than anything that's happened to you in a month. Sometimes you needed to see it, that a person can hold themselves through the weight of everything that is expected of them, and still in the private language of rain and early morning and a brief, awake look across a pavement, be fully, irrevocably, stubbornly there. I threw my coffee cup away eventually. I walked to the tube. I opened the 3 messages on my phone. I don't know why that felt connected. It just did that. I went back the next morning. I know how that sounds. I know it's the kind of thing that, explained to most people, invites a certain gentle concern. Are you all right? Do you have enough to do? Are you perhaps projecting something? Yes, probably, definitely, on all counts. But I went back. It was 6:50 in the morning, which is an hour I have complicated feelings about under normal circumstances and increasingly strong feelings about in London in March, with a light at that hour is the color of a dream you can't quite place. Not dark, not bright, something in between that is more concept than color. I bought a coffee, a proper one this time, from a place 3 streets over where a man named something I couldn't pronounce correctly handed me a cup, and didn't make conversation, and I loved him for it. I stood at the gate. A different guard was in the box, a woman which I noticed, and then noticed myself noticing, and then thought, yes, obviously it's the 21st century, keep up. She was exceptional at the stillness, maybe better than Daniel, if still is something you can be better or worse at, which I've been thinking about, and I think it is. She stood in it the way a person stands in their own kitchen. Completely native. No rain this morning. The sky was that specific London gray that isn't quite threatening and isn't quite forgiving, a sky that is simply making no promises either way and expects you to respect that. I waited. Not for him, exactly. I'd be lying if I said not at all for him. I waited the way you wait when you're hoping for something that you've decided it's not okay to hope for, so you're calling it something else. Proximity. Orientation. I was getting oriented. Around 7:30, I saw him. He wasn't in uniform. He was in civvies, a gray sweatshirt, dark jeans, trainers. He was walking from the direction of wherever they come from to somewhere behind the ceremony that tourists don't have access to. He had a coffee too, and he was looking at his phone, and he was wearing the expression of a person who is reading something and having feelings about it that he is not going to have in public. He looked entirely normal. That's the thing that struck me first, the sheer, ordinary normalcy of him. Without the uniform, he was just a young man in a gray sweatshirt on a gray morning in a gray city, walking to work, squinting at his phone. The architecture of his posture was still there. Some things the body keeps after the ceremony is over, but the ceremony itself was gone, and what remained was just a person, early 20s, tired in the specific way of someone who is always slightly more tired than they let on. He looked up from his phone and saw me, and stopped, just for a beat, the tiniest calibration. The same half-second from yesterday, except this time there was no uniform, no controlled absence, no practiced middle distance to retreat into. This time there was just him and me and a morning and the fresh absence of rain. Then he walked on, past me, into the somewhere behind. I drank my coffee. I thought, there it is. There's your ending. A young man walks to work. Except it wasn't the ending. Or rather, it was the ending of one thing, and something else had started, which is true of most endings if you're paying attention. I've been thinking about what I saw in those 3 seconds in the rain. Not the romantic version. I want to be careful here because this isn't that kind of story, and making it that kind would do something dishonest to what it actually was. What I saw wasn't two people finding each other in the rain with the rain as scenic backdrop for a feeling that was really about them. What I saw was a man being touched by something that didn't need anything from him. That's the simplest version. And the more I sit with it, the more I think the simplest version is the whole truth. We spend so much of every day transacting, not in bad faith. Most of us are not bad faith people. Most of us are just busy and tired and carrying things and trying. But every conversation is a transaction even when it doesn't feel like one. Every interaction has a shape, a call, and response, an implicit agreement about what we owe each other. You say, "How are you?" and I say, "Fine," and you say, "Good," and neither of us means any of it, but both of us mean the doing of it. The contract. The rain doesn't know about the contract. The rain arrives and touches things and moves and doesn't ask for a receipt. Daniel Marsh had stood in 3 hours of a human crowd, treating him as a landmark, photographing him, joking near him, occasionally attempting to breach his perimeter for content. And then the rain arrived and treated him exactly as it treated the pavement and the Silver Star balloon and the elderly women's sensible shoes and me. As a surface, as a thing that was simply there. And something in his face, in that brief fraction of a moment, had looked, the only word I have for it, relieved. I have been thinking since I got home about conversations, specifically about how bad I've gotten at them. And not in the social anxiety way, not the I never know what to say at parties way that everyone relates to, and that has therefore become a safe, friendly failure to own. I mean in the deeper way, the way where you're in a conversation and you're performing the shapes of listening while actually you're running a background process the whole time. What does this person need from me? What am I supposed to say next? Am I saying enough? Am I saying too much? Do they like me? Do I like them? Is this real? Or is this just both of us hitting our marks? I can't remember the last time I was in a conversation, and it rained on me. That's a strange way to put it. It's the most accurate way I have. I can't remember the last time something just arrived and was there and didn't need anything and touched me and moved on and left something behind that wasn't an obligation. Daniel Marsh got that on a Tuesday morning in March. In between 2 hours of people treating him as a prop and one man trying to sign his hat, the rain fell on him and asked nothing. And in the asking of nothing, it gave him something that all the transactions around him hadn't managed to approach. Proof of presence, maybe proof that the world still worked in certain quiet, indifferent ways that weren't about performing or being seen or producing or coping or continuing. Proof that he was a surface, a real one, a surface that could be rained on, That sounds like nothing. I know it sounds like nothing. It's not nothing. The morning I left London, there was rain again. Heathrow in the rain is its own specific atmosphere. All that urgent purposefulness under a washed-out sky, people trailing rolling luggage across wet tarmac, the smell of jet fuel, and something else underneath, something gray and clean. I stood outside the terminal for a minute. My bag strap was cutting into my shoulder. I had a flight to catch. I had the usual machinery of departure running, gate number, boarding time, the mental inventory of whether I'd left anything in the hotel room. The particular anxiety of international travel, which never entirely goes away no matter how many times you've done it. I stood in the rain for 1 minute. Just one. I didn't do anything with it. I didn't think about Daniel Marsh, or the guard, or the Silver Star balloon, or the boy with the hood, counting the guard with his whole face. I didn't construct a lesson or a takeaway or a story, though clearly all of that came later in the slow accounting that happens when you're back in ordinary life, and the extraordinary thing starts to make itself understood. I just stood in it. It rained on me the way it rained on everything. I was a surface, a real one. And after a minute, I picked up my bag, and I went inside. I found out his name 3 weeks later. A small unit profile piece in a regimental newsletter that somebody had posted somewhere, and that an algorithm, in the mysterious way of algorithms, decided I needed to see. Lance Corporal Daniel Marsh, 23, from Shropshire. Steady under pressure was how his sergeant was quoted. Knows how to be still when it matters. There was a photo. Him in uniform, outside the box, the gates behind him. That face, the controlled absence, the deliberate nowhere of his gaze. And just at the edge of the frame, barely there, the kind of detail that only exists if you're looking for it. Rain on his shoulders, darkening them, making them real. Some things don't arrive in conversation. Some things you can only stand still and wait for. And they come down from a sky that doesn't care about you specifically, but lands on you anyway, on you, and the pavement, and the stone, and the Silver Star balloon, and the boy with the hood with the same indifferent, specific, complete attention. And in being rained on the same as everything else, you are for a moment, and then again after that, simply stubbornly, quietly enough.